Hello, everyone. We are delighted to welcome you today. I am Daniela Manoli, board member, sustainability consultant, and the one bringing together Sandra Guerra and Routledge, the publishing house, so the Black Box of Governance would be published in English. About our distinguished panelists of today. Karina Litvak, non-executive board director at ENI in Italy, business director at Business for Social Responsibility and the CFA Institute. Karina is a former financial markets executive with expertise in governance and sustainable development and broad advisory and board experience. Her particular focus has been on the climate transition and how companies can restructure their business model for resilience in a zero carbon world. Sérgio Rial, CEO of Santander Brazil and Vice Chair of Santander Brazil and member of Santander Group Boards. He is also a non-exec director at Delta Airlines. Sérgio has a long career as CEO and CFO of companies and financial institutions and membership in several boards, Brazilian and international. Sandra Guerra, author of The Black Box of Governance and A Caixa Preta da Governança, now going to its 4th edition, updated and expanded, that will reach its Portuguese readers in October this year. Sandra has more than 25 years of experience in boards and corporate governance and is the founding partner at Better Governance. I am sure that this is only a tiny part of their roles. We welcome your questions to the Q&A section. Thank you so much, and I hand the platform to Sandra.
Thank you, Daniela, and particularly thank you so much for approaching Routledge that made possible that the book became an English edition, The Black Box of Governance, and now is reaching from this week on the international readers. So thank you so much for this. I will introduce briefly the book, so we set the scene for this excellent panel that we have with us today, different perspectives from a CEO and former chair, and to become a chair again, Sérgio Real, Karina Litvak, who has been an investor most of her life and has been a board director and a consultant also in ESG. So I don't want to get too much time from these vivid discussions that I'm certain that we are going to have. But to set the scene, I will present the book to you. But before I do so, and a book is, it's a team effort. You cannot do a book alone. And if you do, the book will not be the way you would like it to be. So I have to thank everyone in the book. Is a list that you're going to read in the book. The acknowledgements part is a long one because I really want to thank everyone. But for this particular edition in English, I have to thank one person, which is one of the architects of governance, as we know, internationally. And he is a colleague, a friend, an expert, which is Mike Lubrano, who I know that he is sitting in the platform watching us today. He was very patient with me. He reviewed all the translation, and because of his deep knowledge on governance and board, we have been discussing each chapter, each word that was used in the book. So thank you so much, Mike, for your patience and for your friendship, because only a friend would do what you did with this book. But with further ado, I'm going to select in here the presentation of the book. So, and of course, you're going to have a preview from the presentation that should be, thank you so much. So the black box of governance, boards of directors reviewed by those who inhabit them. And this is a book, and let me share with you that I received mine yesterday. So I'm going to show you later on when I'm not in this position. You're going to have a better view of the book. I'm very excited about it. First of all, why the behavioral approach? Let me tell you that for many years, I've been in this governance role for 26 years now. I have been, very confident that, best practices, training programs, even regulation and self-regulation, although I'm very moderate in regards to my willingness of having regulation. So this would address, and from time to time, we are going to improve governance, and we would work in a safer environment for board directors, for companies, and for all stakeholders. But, I have been witnessing many different crises. In the beginning of the millennium, the corporate scandals of Enron and so on, then the global financial crisis, and many others. And every time everybody would say what boards were doing that were not taking care of all this, right? So with that in mind, I started to understand why boards would not function exactly as the companies and the stakeholders, and particularly the shareholders, would be, looking for these boards to be effective. So that's why I started to research the behavioral approach, and the conclusion that because of the bounded rationality that we humans are, it's part of being human, it's being bounded rational, boards made up of the most competent, diligent, responsible, and committed directors could and can, and we know that they may fail disastrously. So with the behavioral approach, I found that it shows that directors may be hijacked by cognitive biases, because simply because we are human beings and we are vulnerable to biases. When besides the individual cognitive biases in a board, we have another layer, which is the group dynamics. So individual bias, group dynamics can make the board dysfunctional and deflect the board from a certain desirable rationality. So again, directors can be responsible, focused, capable. They can read the pre-reading material. They can talk to executives between meetings. They can do all the efforts. And even then, we cannot guarantee rational effectiveness precisely because of these factors, behavioral factors that I'm bringing here. So which I did was departing from academic and market research, and considering all my experience in board of directors for 26 years, I started to research and to study this. And the book was grounded also in 3 different surveys. One of them with 340 directors responding from more than 40 countries in the world. The research that I have as co-authors, Lucas Barros and Rafael Lisa Santos, and we are still working on a follow-on questionnaire to capture the effects of the pandemic. So I grounded the analysis on this material, but I wanted the book to be very practical. So the book brings lots of cases, or caselets as I call in some ways, to bring the real life situations of the board. And to increase the number of experiences and cases, I interview 31 directors and executives around the world. And besides directors and executives, I also talk with what I call the architects of governance, and what I call in particularly the founding fathers of governance as we know it. And among them, I had the honor to interview Sir Adrian Cadbury from United Kingdom, Mervyn King from South Africa, Ira Milstein from US, and also Robert Monks from US. And I am delighted, and I have to say that today we have with us in the audience Mervyn King and Bob Monks. The two of them were very, very helpful in contributing with me with interviews and support throughout the process of the book, and I'm very honored that they are here today. Ira Milstein also was a big contribution and is one of the writers of the forewords of the book, together with Karina and Sergio. So I cannot be more grateful to them. Sir Adrian passed away 1 year after the interview with me, but he certainly is in the memories of all of us in the governance committee community. So what we get in the book? The inner working of the board is reviewed in the book by the ones who are sitting in the board or interacting with the board. So the topics are what keeps directors awake at night. We cover the behavioral dynamics, both within the board and in the interaction with management. What could be the obstacles to efficient decision making? And as I mentioned, the pitfalls that arise from individual and group bias. These are the chapters of the book. In the first chapter, I cover the board itself and how is the set of the board in different regions and the conditions of composition of the board. The second chapter goes to an individual view of the board director. So who is the typical director? Chapter 3 covers this relation and this tense relation among the board and the executives. I like to use an image to that. If it would be a dance between board and executives, this would be a tango. It would not be a waltz, very swift and mellow. It's, there is it's a strong dance, and it requires both dancing partners to be very, very aligned. We're going to cover that very soon in our panel. The fourth chapter is dedicated to the chair of the board, who has a very important role in the board. The chapter 5 brings what keeps boards awake at night. And the 6 and 7 chapters are the ones who cover the particular behavioral factors. So in the 6, I present the individual and group biases. And in the 7th chapter, I cover what I call the behavioral compass, which is a guide to navigate through all these pitfalls and making board interactions more productive and effective, presenting also some elements that we call the nudge, so mechanisms that will facilitate the board to go to more efficient and rational, if you like, outcomes. So this is the book, and the title, the subtitle is the book is precisely Board of Directors Reviewed by Those Who Inhabit in Them. So let's move then to precisely to discover this. I'm going to try to close here the presentation so we can bring to the floor Sergio and Karina to kick off our discussion. And I'm going to begin with Sergio. So thank you so much, first of all, for both of you being here with us today. Sergio, you have been involved in many difficult decisions as board directors throughout the years. Tell me about situations, particularly the ones involving innovation, where boards face the risk of being, let's say, diverted from the best decision by, as we know, the silent biases. Normally, biases are silent. I like to say that sometimes they are haunting the boards. So a case where not necessarily elements and biases were acknowledged and dealt with, and the result was not good.
No, very good. No, first of all, thank you. Thank you, Sandra, for the invitation. Thank you for inviting me to be part of your book. So I have been extraordinarily pleased to be able to provide some of my experience in the boardroom. I make a comment in the preface of the book, which I truly believe, where I say human beings are not necessarily logical all the time, but psychological. And that applies from the C board level to any level in any organization. It doesn't really matter where you're talking about board or you're talking about management. But your question is related to innovation and how boards respond or do not respond to innovation. And so I would start by saying that I think when we get to a board position, of course, we carry with ourselves a host of experiences that have pretty much shaped the way we consider to be success or not success. So success becomes very much a function of our own experience, as opposed to some degree, us being completely open to also challenge some of the very deep principles about what we learn. The world has changed dramatically. I think that's not in any way news. And the pandemic very recently just accelerated a number of changes. So specifically, I remember very vividly when we at Delta, we were discussing around the sales of articles inside of a plane, whether stopping selling products in a plane, in a flight, primarily international flights, would make a very big difference in customers' views in terms of their own experience during the flight. And Delta was very courageous and continues to be. It's a very innovative airline and tries to really go beyond what normally the average industry would do. I'm very proud of being able to serve the board of Delta. But Delta then said, okay, you know what? I think we better invest our time, resources, and attention to what's coming. And Wi-Fi is a very obvious one, where I think the airlines in general are all fighting to provide a level of service, both in terms of speed, content, and eventually even in streaming to the passengers, rather than what we have experienced over the past years in terms of in and out of a Wi-Fi inside of a plane. So Delta was courageous in basically saying we're collapsing that in-flight service sale, the articles, the perfumes, and the like. You eliminated a certain amount of weight, so that is also providing some true economic value to a particular flight without necessarily jeopardizing a customer experience. And I think when you look today, Sandra, very concrete examples around how the digital world is going to impact and how now the pandemic is going to impact flying, but that could apply to any service industry. We as a board, we need to be very connected, not only with management, but being incredibly open, not being completely and only formed by our own experiences, but actually challenging, perceiving, asking, and be prepared to test uncharted waters. And that's what's going to be happening in most industries. It doesn't matter where you're in the restaurant business, we're in the hotel business, in the leisure business, or even in just a B2B industry. So I think we are really coming into a space now where the role of boards in the concept of innovation, and innovation is not necessarily new to the world. It's not inventing what anybody has invented. It's about doing what we are doing today. That's one description, significantly better from a customer point of view, and eventually, of course, thinking on the add-on that are today becoming more and more relevant to consumers overall. I think I remember now in the financial industry, we have moved away from having clients in the historic sense to consumers that are who are actually voting on us each and every day. So the capacity to navigate different players in the same industry has become incredibly easy to any consumer. I mean, opening a bank account today it's incredibly easy. It doesn't matter which country you are, which wasn't the case 30 years ago. So any barriers to navigate industries are being eliminated as we speak, have already been eliminated to a large degree, which forces companies and boards to really start taking a much deeper look at the consumers you're serving, the consumers you're providing value, and how is that going to impact the future of the company you are serving. So I'll stop here. I don't want to take more time. So thank you.
No, thank you. And all that you were saying, it comes to my mind that it's a very fertile environment to biases, because to have this openness, you need to learn how to unlearn, to be open to all this innovation and these trends in the world, right? So, and this is much easier said than done, right, Sergio?
No doubt. Your book tries to, and does it superbly. We can't forget that a board, it is a group of executives that carry, as you correctly pointed out, their own biases. And more than that, we all carry to some degree a certain level of, we know what success looks like and we know how to get there. There's a certain intellectual arrogance when you get to a board that is very, very dangerous and probably not very conducive for boards to actually truly listen to what management is saying. So being open, that doesn't mean that you have learned necessarily that during your management time. It's an exercise of getting to an emotional level of maturity that your principles and your concepts can be challenged. You haven't found the truth in the sense of success or business models. And that's very, very difficult because remember, we can be trapped in our own intellectual arrogance. And being open and truly humble in the right sense, that say, you know what, I may be wrong. Maybe there's a different path. Maybe I'm not really listening. Maybe I'm trapped in my own fear or in my own unsuccessful experience that is very similar to what it's being discussed. The fact that I failed in a relatively similar context, that doesn't mean that management that is bringing a very similar or very close type of suggestion, it triggers the same level of failure. So that's what I call the humility, in the sense, listen, let me open. I fail in a very similar experience, but I'm open to understand why is it going to be different here.
Right. So exciting, these topics. But Karina, you know that talking about novelty and talking about topics that, are really have to open the mind and hearts. And in this case, I'm going to ask you, it's more than open the minds, also open the hearts. Mm-hmm. You are sitting in an oil company board, and you have in your history and expertise in climate transition. And how boards should govern the zero carbon race. So you possibly have very good stories on the rejection and the negation to the inevitable path to reduce the world temperature. By the way, not mentioning your endeavor with the World Economic Forum of defining a model on how boards should navigate this topic. So I believe, and I would assume, that the group thinking or herd effect on boards have been playing quite a role in the ESG agenda. What do you say, Karina?
Absolutely, and the model that you referenced that I was able to help create with the World Economic Forum is frankly something that I pushed for because I didn't have everything that I needed to be heard on the board. Basically, when you bring a topic that is as disruptive as climate change to an oil and gas company, it's an uncomfortable subject. It's, because it calls into question the very business model of the company. And, to be quite honest, it took about 6 years, but for the first 6 years or so, I should differentiate between the CEO with whom I had a conversation 3 weeks into my term, who was completely on board, completely understood the existential nature of the climate crisis, and understood that if he did not step out of his comfort zone and do something really transformational, there would be no company at some stage long after he was gone, and nobody would blame him, but he would still have been a contributing factor in the obsolescence of his company. So he got that, but he also got, and we discussed, the complexity of this challenge, because you need to bring everyone with you. You need to bring your board with you, and your investors and your employees, and in our case, the Italian government, which is a 30% investor. And I remember citing to him an example in that very first conversation, 3 weeks into my mandate and his, because he had just been promoted to CEO, where I said to him, look, Lord Brown, who was the CEO of BP, was an incredibly innovative thinker, and he just plowed forward with his ideas and did what he pleased, and did what he pleased, and in particular drove this shift of BP to beyond petroleum. And many people remember beyond petroleum and with derision. I think it was actually absolutely insightful, and it's just that the world was too slow. But the moment that he had to resign unexpectedly because of something completely unrelated, his successor undid everything he had done, everything. And the board did not stop that. The board that had approved everything up until Lord Brown's departure did not stand up and say, hold on a minute, we bought into this old one, or we bought into the previous strategy, why are we doing a complete U-turn? And so my message to my CEO at that stage was, don't be Lord Brown, right? Get this, figure this out, bring everybody that you need to bring on board with you before you unveil it, because you need us, the board, to be your insurance policy if there are challenges ahead. And that's exactly what he did. And so for 6 years, it was all happening in the background. And meanwhile, I was, dialoguing with him, but also dialoguing with all my board colleagues. And this is where I think the psychology around disruption is so difficult, because, the very nature of disruption is that it's not easily predictable, easily modelable. And so we, and I was serving at the time on this scenarios and sustainability committee, which I now chair. But for 6 years, I was a mere member. And, and the information that we were getting was, the model says, the model has always worked this way, and the model has always been relatively successful. And so the model didn't have the capacity to incorporate massive disruption, such as you need to model for disruption when you're talking about a climate transition strategy. And the board members, the reaction I got again and again was, well, we've never done that sort of thing, or, well, this is not the job of a board. This is the job of policymakers. We're not here to substitute for government. What you're suggesting is really putting the company in the position of walking away from profitable business. That's contrary to our fiduciary obligations. The number of perfectly rational objections was such that, I kind of thought, I don't know if we're ever going to succeed in doing this, because the overwhelming view is, let's carry on doing what we're doing, because we're already leaders. We're already, winning awards for the best reporting and, the best efficiency gains. But nobody was thinking in terms of taking the business model, turning it upside down, and reimagining who we could be. That's a whole other dimension of strategic thinking. And it was not happening. And it ended up happening. And I remember having sometimes fierce arguments around, for example, the concept of what is called scope 3 emissions, which is the CO2 emissions that an oil and gas company generates through the consumption of its products. Okay, so oil and gas is an extremely energy intensive operation. Just to explore and drill and refine and transport, that releases a huge amount of operational emissions. But then if you look at the emissions that are released from people filling their car or powering their power plant, that's a factor of 6 to 7 times what we emit as a company. And I could not persuade my colleagues that we needed to take responsibility for those emissions, because they said it's not our problem, it's the clients. And my argument was, but our clients are going to find a better product if we don't supply it. Right. So it's a competitive issue for us. It's not a moral issue. People are not interested in the barrel of oil per se. They're interested in mobility and heating and cooling and lighting and powering their factories. And whether it comes from a barrel or comes from an electron, they couldn't care less. So if someone else comes along with this, with a clean product, we will be out of business very quickly. It's a competitive issue. It's not, and that was the type of discussion that, we were having to have. So I'm very, very excited, by the fact that after 6 years, we did it. We did come out with a really transformational, frankly, radical, and that was the word the CEO used, radical transformation strategy. But it was not smooth sailing. We had people who were obstructionist on the board. We had people who were benignly passive, didn't mind if we did or if we didn't. But nobody, frankly, except me, rattling the cage and saying, this is an existential matter for us, and it is extremely urgent. We must change. And now we've got that.
And it's very interesting that you say that, because, sometimes it's very important that you have in the board someone that, take the courage and that, gets all the problem involved in an idea. So you have to have a very strong understanding and conviction about the topic to go into this kind of battle sometimes until the others will start to open their minds to or innovation, or this is innovation as well. But let me move to another topic now, because, it's interesting that Sergio, if you recall, I think that when Sergio opened his mic, there is an echo. I'm going to close right after. But Sergio, you will recall that when I interviewed for the Brazilian book in, I believe, 2015, you were the chair of the board of Santander. When I was launching the book, you became the CEO of Santander. Now we work together, and you wrote the foreword, you were the CEO, and when the book is being launched, you announce that you will succeed and you will be the chair of Santander board. So, I think that my book's productions pretty much is in pace of your movements in your career. I want to talk precisely about the question of secession in boards, and you are very well positioned to talk on that. This is a very sensitive issue for boards and to the ones who have to prepare the succession and prepare the plan for his or her succession. And this is not necessarily a field where rationality prevails, although it's intended to prevail. How boards and executives could mitigate the inevitable biases that permeate this sort of process involving people, power, and a high doses of risk?
No, thank you. This is probably, if not the most important, one of the most important functions and tasks of a board, which is to plan succession. In my case, we were surprised with a very personal decision of the CEO at that time, And it's not very uncommon to see within the board, which is not ideal, but within the board, a possible path towards what I would call a succession that was created surprisingly, which happened in my case. So I certainly went to serve as CEO of the company. I did that for the last 6 years. I'm going to be completing my tenure at the end of this year. And then I come back to chair, which there are pluses and minuses for all that sort of migration, no? And you got to be very, very careful. One of the things besides taking care and growing, doing what a CEO is supposed to do from a shareholder point of view, in line and in with the respective board, is paying a lot of attention to the culture. I find that there's nothing more important in terms of legacy of a CEO besides, of course, performance is a given. If you don't have it, you probably can't sustain your position as CEO. But performance goes much beyond the numbers. It's really what you're able to create with a group of individuals that will make that particular company not just seeking to be different for the sake of being different, but really creating a competitive edge relative to the industry you're operating. And I absolutely believe the culture is a big differentiator. And I also think boards tend not to take enough time to understand the cultural fabric and the evolution of the same. By understanding the culture and understanding what kind of competencies and new skills and everything that is happening as the world is changing, and you've got to incorporate in the company's culture, that's where succession starts. And it's very common when you're a CEO, and I think we've seen that historically in many large companies, you have the classic, just high-powered individual, strong views, strong desire to accomplish, to perform. So the flexibility or the openness of succession normally from a CEO needs to be stimulated by the board. A very good CEO, of course, and that's most of the case, will think from day one about his or her own succession as he continues or she continues to evolve and continues to perform. But it's not that natural. Because it is not natural, it is up to the board to constantly be attentive to the potential candidates internally and externally, the classic work of a board in terms of succession. But the real piece that I find it to be intriguing is how much do you want to change with the new CEO coming, particularly when you are in a board where the incumbent CEO is so successful. Because changes of CEO where you do not have the desired outcome is not very difficult. When it becomes difficult is very successful CEOs. And how do you ensure that success with a certain degree sometimes of change, because the world has changed. Consumer insights, CRMs, technology, channels, distribution models have been changing as we speak. So how far do you go in that change in order not to, of course, jeopardize what has been accomplished so far, but definitely creating a different path to the same sort of growth, but perhaps with different edges. That is an art that I find it to be very, very difficult because it basically boils down to individual risk profiles of each board member. And remember, most of us have grown in times and business models where the velocity of change is not what we are experiencing today. We just heard Karina talking about moving to a low carbon economy, which does not only impact fossil fuel companies or telecom companies, it actually impacts any business model in the world. And it's highly politicized because people perceive that to be, a political discussion as such. And it has become, in many leading nations, climate change has become part of the political agenda when it's fundamentally a science-based discussion. So all these new variables that are coming into stream, and it's right coming into the board, many of us haven't really been exposed in the past. And when we have, we've been perhaps less sophisticated in the way we would deal with these sort of issues, as opposed to have a much more complex thinking process around the complexity, the unintended consequences, and the multiple stakeholders today around the table that are far more than the classic shareholders, society, and the employees. I think the world has tribalized itself. There are different voices, strong voices, extraordinarily well organized in the internet world that has become part of reality, and that does impact companies' future. So I find it to be absolutely thrilling, but succession, it's more than just give me the classic 3-name list, and from there we take the decision. It's a much broader, complex discussion.
Absolutely, and where behavioral factors are very, very vivid in the discussion. But listen, Karina and Sergio, we have a challenge here because we are receiving so many questions. And before I move to the questions of the audience, I still have one question that I want to pose to Karina. And my suggestion to us, to the three of us, is that we keep it the shortest we can at this point to bring the questions. I know that we are already responding one of the questions from Claudia Pozniakov. Sorry, Claudia, because she was asking regarding the main corporate challenges to next year's based in your solid experience until today. So I think that we have been covering this already. And now I move to the question to Karina, which is, I know that it's a tough question and a tough experience that Karina had. As board director of Eni, which is an Italian multinational oil and gas company headquartered in Rome, and considered one of the 7 super major oil companies in the world. Karina, you have lived a true saga, I cannot say anything else, in the so-called Syracuse affair, or any affair if I consider the 3 different cases that are connected with one another. You were accused of, and I have a list, I have to read this, of smearing the CEO to remove him from office, accused of damaging the company reputation, disclosing confidential internal documents, conspiring with Nigerian officials in regards to a transaction. And last but not least, as the only Jewish, you were also accused of colluding with the Israeli Mossad to delegitimize the then Italian prime minister. It seems a movie, but it was not. It's the real case. After enormous pressures of your then board colleagues related to the news and in a small paper, and an investigation launched by an obscure deputy prosecutor in Syracuse, in Sicily, the case bounced back and forth for months in the Italian judicial systems, and when it finally reached the right jurisdiction, Milan, the case was declared invalid, and it was dropped in simply 3 days. At the end, 15 people, including the initial prosecutor that started the investigation in Syracuse, were indicted and jailed in a case that was concluded as an attempt to obstruct the justice in regards to the real investigation of the transaction in Nigeria. So let's leave a part of this, all the criminal actions and the corruption involved, because this is a book that you have to write someday. But let's consider in all this saga, did any cognitive bias play the role, particularly in the attitude of the board that was later on totally renovated?
Yeah.
And sorry, I posed a big question and I asked for a short answer.
Sure. No, and first of all, apologies to the audience if what you just ran through is confusing. It's fantastical and shocking. And even as I had the privilege of working on, something that was, in my view, historic, the transformation of an oil and gas major, I was also the subject of this utterly bizarre, phony criminal investigation, which had nothing to do, by the way, with the climate work I was doing. A lot of investors queried that. It had to do with the fact that I had asked some, uncomfortable questions about a transaction that the company had been involved in that was the subject of a very, very large corruption investigation. And so to your question, what happened is that a tiny, obscure news agency published these crazy allegations that you just listed. The story was not picked up by the mainstream media in Italy because everyone knew that this is not real news. But the board reacted instantaneously to remove me, actually, firstly, to encourage me to resign, right, from the board. And because I was nominated by the investors in a system, much like you have in Brazil, actually, where the investors get to choose, in our case, 1/3 of the board, I went back to the Investor Association to say, are these the circumstances that would require me to offer my resignation? And basically they said, hell no, hell no, keep doing what you're doing. And so what I had was this bizarre information, the board trying to get me to resign, me refusing, because I'm thinking the investors are backing me, and the board, the chairman not having the ability to force me off the board, but having the ability to force me off the committee, the risk and audit and so forth committee that supervises anti-corruption compliance, and going public with the news that Karina Litvak has been removed with immediate effect from the Risk and Controls Committee as a result of a criminal investigation involving alleged wrongdoing in the company, which was also reported in the media by some no-name paper. That news prompted the mainstream media to pick it up and somehow gave legitimacy to a story that was absurd beyond words. And so the cognitive kind of patterns that evolved out of this was surreal. It was me in a room with 13 other people asking me why I had colluded with corrupt members of the Nigerian judiciary and petroleum ministry, and why I had sent these internal documents that don't exist, and why I wanted to smear the chief executive. And I've just described to you how collaborative my relationship was with the chief executive on the one issue I think is most important. So it was completely fantastical. But I remember turning to my board and saying, look me in the eye and tell me that you believe that I colluded with the Israeli Mossad. Because if you believe that, then we really have a problem. And they all looked down and said, well, it's not for us to judge, it's for the judicial authorities to judge. And so they all participated in this fiction. Not a single one of them objected. And I know this because I was kicked out of the room when the discussion was had about kicking me off the committee and so forth. And I then asked a couple of friendly faces on that board. I said, did anybody kind of speak out and say, this is bizarre. Why are we even lending credence to something like this? I mean, look at her. Does this sound like the kind of thing she'd do? And she's telling us that this is a colossal fabrication. Why are we rushing to do this? Why aren't we letting her get a lawyer to help, defend her? Nobody, not one soul on that board spoke out. And that to me is so revelatory of the dysfunction that can happen in a group of people. I mean, we were talking earlier about how boards are made up of people, oftentimes very successful, but intelligence and experience alone are not sufficient to have a board behave in a way that has integrity and courage. And it took a certain courage for somebody to say, hold on a minute, this is nonsense. Why are we even talking about this? Can we get back to the business of the board? Not one person, not one.
Yeah. And it's really interesting because boards as a group of people can be captured by situations like, you know, a strong leader, for instance, or a group of people that are new, or, you know, have relations with others. So many of the group biases explain this sort of incredible reaction that you had in this board. So I thank you so much for being so candid and sharing this experience with us. But I certainly would invite you to write a book, because I think we have to learn all the suffering that you had, at least will be shared and produce a learning process. Let me say that I'm going to kick off now the questions, and we have to be even shorter because we have only 8 minutes. So I have a question from Eulalia Sanin from Colombia, asking Sergio and me, in your experience, how does redesigning the conversations, the way that boards and management interact, help with each other, have an effect on reaching better behaviors and outcomes? And it's a little elevator speech of a low building. So 1 minute to each question. Sergio? Can you take, possibly Sergio is not listening. Okay. Go ahead, Sergio.
Sandra, I had problems to listen. The connection was not very good. Can you repeat the question? Can you repeat the question, maybe in a shorter version?
Sure. How does redesigning the conversations, the way boards and management interact, can be more effective, reaching better behaviors and outcomes, the interaction boards and management? Go ahead, Sergio.
Okay, so I think can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Okay, so I have a very relatively simple principle, Sandra, which is the role of the board is to understand rather than to be understood. So it's to really seek to understand truly with keen interest and the right set of questions. I think the magic and the art of a board is to articulate the right questions for the discussion in question. So I would say, seek to understand, don't try to be understood, take the time and the energy to really ask the right set of questions, which should never be threatening, not questions to ask to kill, or questions that management clearly sees that there are embedded biases in the potential outcome in terms of answers.
Thank you. I have a question from William Frater, saying that he's very interested in behavioral elements of the board. And he asks, why do people become board members, face the conflicts, liabilities, and challenges and time commitment? It's personal gain, ego, duty, altruism. To what extent are these individuals' motivations determinants of the culture and effectiveness of the board? Karina, can you tackle that? You are on mute.
Yeah, sorry. Yes, thank you. That's such an insightful question. Look, I think that particularly for the largest companies that are, really iconic in their countries, there is no doubt that there's an element of prestige that's associated with serving on the board of such a company. And if that is the dominant motivator for getting on the board, as opposed to adding value, really making a difference, then yes, you're going to get people who play it safe and whose main goal is to be renewed. I think to be a good board member, I completely subscribe to Sergio's point about your questions need to be constructive. You're not looking to ambush or embarrass anybody. You're looking to be helpful. And in my case, what I would often say is, putting myself in the shoes of people who see us from the outside, I fear that they will see it through this lens, and they will challenge us on this and this and this grounds. So what's our answer to that? And how do we make sure that we don't even get into that hot water? And to me, that's how you add value. But if your goal, if you're concerned about that being risky, I mean, basically, I think to be a good board director, you have to be prepared to take risks, and even if it means not being renewed. In my case, it was terrifying, but I think it's still really important to have that level of moral courage.
Tell me about that, Karina. I understand you very well. I have a question here from John Lukomnik from USA. Hello, John. Do you find the use of personality tools like predictive index or Myers-Briggs helpful in understanding the behavior tendencies of board members and of the board overall, particularly in seeking new board members? I would say, John, that every tool used to better understand the individuals and the group dynamics are good. We are in the beginning of this process. Boards still do not understand how to use mechanisms to, improve and to consider all these behavioral aspects. Board evaluations are still babies if you consider the amplitude and the possibility of having, these elements better understood. And certainly the board matrices will evolve from competencies to involve and to consider more behavioral aspects in the future. So I think that we have to develop precisely these instruments to adapt to board situations, and I intend to also to research that. Any comment? I invite you to do is that the last comments of Sergio and Karina.
No, I fully agree with what you just said. I think you need to truly understand why you're there. What's the purpose besides, I think, what Karina so well explained around the prestige. I mean, depending on the name you're talking about, what's the reason for you to be in that board? I think sometimes chairs don't take enough time understanding the truth. So I think we look very much at the experiences, and I think they're incredibly valuable and important in terms of mix and how you think about the board composition. But we don't spend enough time thinking about why you're here, where you're going with this. And that, I think, it's equally important to understand where people want to go with that seat.
Karina, your final comments.
Sure, I'll just add a memorable observation that was made by the chairman of the board of actually a medium-sized Italian company once at a conference. He said, look, I can teach any director, facts. I can impart technical knowledge, but I can't teach them values and courage. And that's something you either have or you don't. And that's what separates I think the noble directors from those who will just fit in, even if they, in their conscience, disagree with what they're supporting.
That's a very, very nice thought for us to end this discussion. I'm very, very thankful for you both, Sergio and Karina. Thank you so much. I would like to thank the audience and respond for one of the questions about the book. What this book, and I promise to show you here the book, what this book has new in regards to the last edition in Portuguese. The book was totally updated and expanded. So many concepts, including Sergio, who was writing the foreword in the Portuguese edition, renew totally his foreword, incorporating, a concept, the pandemic situation that we are living, incorporating the racial issues that, increase the awareness for diversity. So the book was updated, new interviews. So it's kind of a pretty much updated book than the one. So let me only say to the Portuguese readers that wait for a second, that in October, the 4th edition of A Caixa Preta da Governança will also reach the Brazilian and the Portuguese markets. So with that, thank you so much to be with us. I thank the audience. We had over 300 people registering from this webinar. I'm very excited with all this. Thank you so much, and I see you, and I hope you enjoy the Black Box.
And thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
All right.